Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Laura with Connect My Brain. Thanks so much for tuning in. We are talking about the world of reflexes. We've been working through the different reflexes, and for simplicity, I would break them up into three categories. The first category that we talked about was the withdrawal reflexes. And one of the principal things that goes on in the withdrawal period is actually teaching the nervous system how to survive. Now, remember, a reflex puts something into the neurology. It gives the body-brain experience on how to handle something from the most primitive level. When I use the word primitive, I am referring to the beginning of life. And it's important to realize how much work and how much practice literally goes on inside of us in order to accomplish really anything. And I want to tie that thought back because it is such a foundational principle so that you can understand when you evaluate yourself outside of reflexes. Sometimes we might ask ourselves, how did I get here? What was it that I've been practicing that literally has brought me to where I am right now? And if you're open, you will begin to allow yourself to think about this. And to me, it's a fundamental piece that is necessary if you truly want to transform your mind. And the reason I tie it back to reflexes is because this is our fundamental place for learning how to be a human. It's really, in my opinion, it's not our spiritual side, but it's our fundamental human side of how we got wired up and why, when things are presented from a clinical perspective, I always have wanted to go back to the original shift, the original place of origin, the original time where the nervous system got derailed. And over the years, I've been doing this 27 years. Over the years of doing this, I would really say probably 90% of the time, there's some origin back at the very beginning. Now, it doesn't mean everything goes back to the very beginning, but just in my experience, my clinical experience, and the work that I do, especially with children, it brings me back to the fundamental place of all learning, which are the reflexes. Many years ago, I actually called my practice Original Development. And then as more adults were interested in neurofeedback, I added the name Connect My Brain. And then I decided I'll always keep Original Development in my heart, but the practice is now called Connect My Brain. And it is for children. It is for adults. It is for trauma. It is for injury. It is for imbalances inside of our human physiology, because we need the connection in our brain, and it completely relies on the chemistry. It completely relies on the connectivity. That's the communication directly in the brain to drive everything else. But it all really did get started mechanically. Think about for a minute a baby, and there's certain things that we expect that baby to do. We expect the baby to lift its head. We expect that baby to cry. We expect that baby to need us. We expect that baby to start exploring their world, moving around, and a full year down the road, they're going to stand up in gravity. I mean, that is just huge when you really sit down and you think about it. None of those pieces can be missed. You need every step in order to wire up this nervous system. So the withdrawal is where we started. And when I look at that context of the fundamental place where things get started, the first thing that you have to be able to do is survive. And you have to be able to interpret threat. So that's the big picture behind the withdrawal. But for the child who still has that reflex trying to be in control, that child's very distracted. That child is literally responding to every single sensory stimulus because innately it's trying to figure out if it's a threat or not. As an adult, if you skim your arm on a hot pot, you don't sit there and go, wow, my flesh is burning. You literally pull your arm away. You withdraw it. So there are things that we can see when it doesn't get inhibited like it's supposed to. And then we can see its mature action for safety. Then we shift and we go into the primitive reflexes. That's what most of these podcasts have been on. And we've looked at Moro, we've looked at Palmar, we've looked at rooting, and today we're going to look at Spinal Galant. And each of those, as you're going to learn with Spinal Galant today, each of those have a fundamental job. And it's all before we actually innately go towards sensory motor. These primitive reflexes are the rudimentary place of all learning. They precede reading, writing, and arithmetic. They precede sensory motor. And when they do not inhibit as they're expected, they will constantly trip up the communication from the lower brain to the higher brain. It's one of the reasons why I love neurofeedback, because even when we talk about how the brain communicates, the brain is still going to communicate to the brainstem, but it's going to do it for specific functions and actions. But it is also then going to get wired up to higher brain levels so that there are more mature reasonings going on in order for the body to function and in order for the individual to function. So they never really go away, but they stop being in control. Because when there's this battle, this is when it changes the adaptation of the human being. So looking at children, there are 5 categories of assessment: fine motor, gross motor, social communication, and adaptation. And adaptation is, in my opinion, one of the biggest areas for many of these children that is missed. We can show you what's happening with fine motor, like handwriting. You can get a writing sample, you can see it. We can show you very easily gross motor, when a child cannot do a typical cross-crawl pattern. You probably can pick up faster than even me socially, or the teacher saying your child's having a really hard time mixing with their peers. And children should innately go towards everything, because as I'm going to refer to this in the adaptive mechanism as well, they have no point of reference. So they don't look at situations based on experiences, but rather they're building their experiences about how they're going to communicate with their peers. And if that practice is withdrawal and moving away, then over time, it literally has become a feedback mechanism. Please keep in mind patterns. What you practice is exactly where you're going. And so if you want something different, it's like the hamster in the wheel. Is he really getting anywhere? We've got to get off the wheel. And if we've always been going to the right, we've got to go to the left. And that's where supportive care can help people move in that direction. So adaptation really comes at a huge cost because children don't have a point of reference to tell you how they're tripping up, how they're having problems where, Mom, it's like whenever I try to hold a pencil, my hand completely wraps around it. I'm squeezing the daylights. My hand actually hurts. And then, when I go to look at my paper, it's just like my arm wants to fly out. They don't have that point of reference. You would be talking about such a higher level of cognitive control to be able as a child to even understand that those things are even going on. So let's talk about Spinal Galant. This one comes on board about 20 weeks in the womb. It is active in the birth process, and it is supposed to be inhibited or integrated between 3 and 9 months after birth. Okay, so the first thing that I want to break down is the time frame that this gets started. So this is about midpoint of pregnancy. So there's still quite a bit of time left before the baby is born. And there's some beautiful pieces that go with what is believed to happen with Spinal Galant while still in the womb. Before I go there, let's talk about the birth process. This is a very interesting part of human experience, both for mom and baby. I know for myself, my first child was a C-section, and I felt back at that time, which is 35 years ago, I didn't know what really having a baby was like because, one, this healthcare wasn't my career. I was actually thinking I was going to be a lawyer, go figure. But I didn't know much about the body and having a baby and that kind of thing. I was very physical, but not from the standpoint of understanding all the different things that go on. And one of the things that really stands out about that particular pregnancy is at that time, I had been involved in actually being a competitive bodybuilder. And I had worked at getting ready for a show for about 5 years because every single time I attempted to get scheduled for a show, something would happen either for the women's division or for the natural division. And I did not take any type of steroids or anything like that, but I absolutely loved working out at this intensity. And it was also something, the reason I was so innately in tune into what I was doing was because I was a heavier child after the 4th grade. And I didn't know any of this stuff. And in my family of origin, exercise, I mean, we went out and played, but back then, the type of food we were eating, I mean, it just blows my mind that I would have ever have eaten half the stuff that we did as a family. But back then, that's what happened. And then when I went to college, that's when things were just so interesting. And I started to learn about a target heart rate and about aerobic activity and about, if you exercise at this level, you're going to lose weight. So it was learning, and then application, and then excitement about putting it together and literally sculpting my body. That key word in there is excitement, because the brain really tunes in to what we get excited about. But there's another side. I, as a pregnant woman, didn't want to gain weight. Well, that really doesn't match pregnancy. And then in my mind, I also said, you know what? I'm going to be that woman who doesn't gain weight, goes through this with no problem. Well, I was incredibly mistaken. There is a neurological loop, much like these reflexes, that is innately designed to allow a woman to increase the size of her abdomen. We actually lose sarcomeres, which is an individual motor unit of a muscle, in order to allow the body to expand. I'm sorry, increase it, not decrease it, increase it. And then there's hormones that literally are relaxing everything. So the point is that I was literally putting my mind state working against what my body knew that it had to do. And so at the time of delivery, rather than there being this beautiful passage and dance between mom and baby, it was a battle. And unfortunately, my baby got stuck. And I ended up with a C-section. My baby ended up with a cone head. And this was my journey in going in the direction that I'm going into today. And that birth impacted the development of my baby. And then as later on, when I had a second child, and now being involved in healthcare, I wanted to know that my body could do it. And I actually had a home delivery for my second child. And it was two totally different experiences. And it really helped me open my mind to understand that there is this innate design, divine design, that a woman should go through. And today, one of the areas that I feel very strong about is helping couples plan to have a baby. In order to have the best outcome, the best possible outcome, we need to plan these events so that you're ready, you know what to expect, you can create a birth plan, and you can be involved in the pregnancy and then ultimately the delivery. And the delivery is a dance. It's a dance between mom and baby. And at the beginning of this, I'm going to go back just a little bit, because around 7.5 months of pregnancy is when that baby is going to flip and go upside down. So this is going to connect the dots to the word breech presentation, as well as if a baby is not moving through its own progression in the womb, it's still going to interfere with these reflexes that we're talking about, because there is an expected environment. So around prior to 7.5 months, we're also looking at the head is upward. The spine of the baby is predominantly going to be more to the left side of the mother's body because of her liver, and there being less room on the right side of her body. So there is this known orientation. And then the baby is getting the bones of the skull are closest to that influence of gravity because the head is up. Now around 7.5 months, the baby is going to turn. If we don't have that event, then this is what's thought to be a breech presentation. And sometimes moms are going to go and attempt to have the baby turned. There are many practitioners in chiropractic that really focus on a particular technique known as the Webster in uterine release technique. And what this is doing is putting the mother's body in the best position in order to allow the baby to turn. So it's not specifically about going in and turning a baby. It's about allowing mom's body to be in that right position so that the baby gets in the right position. Sometimes this technique works beautifully and things happen very quickly. In my experience, I've seen and have worked with women where the baby turns down and then pops right back up. And this goes on several times. To me, this is a vestibular component. The vestibular is inside of your ear. It has 3 canals, and it's all about orientation of body parts. It's all about body parts in space, and that space is also inside of your womb. And when we couple the work with the vestibular system, we get even better results. So now around 7.5 months, when that baby turns, now the pelvis is upward, and now the law of gravitational influence is going to take place. And this is literally how our baby's bones are starting to harden. Now, as labor commences, baby is going to secrete hormones into the mother's bloodstream and via the umbilical cord, and the position of the baby, it's moving down into the pelvis, and typically the front of the face is going to be cupped into the mother's sacrum. And if we think about the pelvis for a second, you have 2 bones, one on each side. Those are called iliums. And then in the middle, there is this triangle shape bone called the sacrum. And when babies are born, typically we are going to see the back of their head, because that way the face is protected from the pubic bone in the front of the pelvis. And sometimes we call them sunny side up babies. And sometimes we get bottoms first, feet first, things of that nature. But there is a known orientation of the way that baby should present. Now, the other part of the commencement of labor is that the cranial bones are literally going to fold down over and onto themselves, not only on the outside. So for my podcast audience, I'm literally like taking my hands over my head. It's not just the outer bones, it's all the bones inside of the cranial vault. And we are going to take an average 15 centimeter head and squish it down to 10. And that's why a woman's pelvis will open up 10 centimeters to pass the baby. Now, we also, as a baby, we're going to tuck our chin. It lines up our neck, and we're going to move that head out first because it's there. It's supposed to be the first part out. Now, the broadest part of the body has to come out, and that's the shoulders. So we talked about ATNR in a previous podcast. This is where the baby's head turns, the arm and leg extend on that side, and the baby rolls its shoulder through the opening. And then there's a pause, the baby turns its head, and it's going to do it again to the other side. Now, the pubic bone is going to ride along the paraspinal musculature. So this is literally the pubic bone of mom up against the back of the head of the baby, pressing into the spinal muscles, while on the front of the baby, the sacrum is also compressing the torso. So again, podcast audience, I'm literally trying to demonstrate this with my hands. This is such an important part. This is going to take us into spinal galant because that one is spinal galant. So it's literally part of the birth process. And it has everything to do with stimulating all of the torso organs, from the throat to the heart to the lungs to the bronchi to all of your tummy organs to your bladder to your bowel, etc. And once the baby is delivered, the baby typically urinates, and that's getting out the byproduct of pregnancy. And then there is the notorious first bowel movement, which is also getting out the byproduct of pregnancy. And this culmination is via the spinal galant. Wow. I mean, that's a lot of work, right? So this particular reflex has a lot to do with bowel and bladder. And so children that 5 years old or older that are still wetting the bed, it is thought that this reflex is still in control. And so now in your mind's eye for a minute, imagine that baby coming through the birth canal and everything on the back and the front being stimulated and its connection to emptying the bowel and the bladder. So if I go one step further and just kind of think about life, child is born, moving around, doing its thing, and now they're going to school. These are the kids that tags bother them, seams of socks bother them, as well as like something around the waistband. They have a very difficult time sitting in a seat because then the back of the chair is always stimulating this particular reflex, and that's kind of known as the kid with the ants in the pants. So there's a lot of interesting pieces that are related to spinal galant, bowel, bladder, close, but it's also associated with the ATNR. So everything is about a layer. It's never about a reflex functioning by itself. So let's also go back to the womb for just a minute. This particular reflex, because it involves the spine and anything touching the spine, this is in the womb, amniotic fluid vibration. So in some research, it talks about that spinal galant is what is responsible to facilitate the feeling of sound. And I really want to put that word feeling in quotes, because lots of times when I'm describing these things to parents, I'm letting them know that these children, as we move through these different progressional pieces, they have to feel it. Nobody was doing it to them when they were innately functioning. So it is so important for the child to feel what it is that you're trying to change. And sound has such an interesting development. So when you come into this world, you hear low frequency sound. You have to acquire middle and high, which you will by the third birthday. Not only are we getting this progression of low, middle, high frequency, but the cochlea, inside of the cochlea is a membrane analyzer. And it literally is what's going to lay down those frequencies. And at the very beginning, the low frequency sounds are actually interpreted at the base of the cochlea, farthest outside. And over that 3 years, sound is being laid down to where ultimately low frequencies will end up at the apex, deep within the cochlea. Unbelievable how divine we are put together. So this is such a big deal when we're looking at child development, because are they easily startled by sound? Are they having trouble hearing? Are they hearing too much? Years ago, there used to be these audiologists that looked at so many of the frequencies, because you could be okay, let's say at 512 hertz, but maybe you're not at 630. So they only have a tendency to do a few frequencies, and you may be missing the frequency that is really disrupting them. And it really can happen that way. And then on top of it, if you want to get these kinds of specialized tests, they've just become so expensive. It's so hard for people to get that information. So here at Connect My Brain, when I do a developmental assessment, while I don't think it is the most objective test on the planet, I do use 3 different frequencies. I look where it lateralizes. I look at air and bone conduction, but I couple it with function. I couple it with looking at these reflexes and how do they connect those dots. I look at it as it relates to lateralization. Did their brain get organized like it's supposed to? Eye, ear, hand, and foot, all on the correct, on a side, on the same side. It doesn't matter if it's all left or all right. It just needs to be all on one side. Now, in addition to the feeling of sound, this particular reflex, the way that it stimulates those paraspinal musculature, it literally causes a lateral flexion to that side. And so the arm and leg are actually involved. The head is involved. The hands are involved. So this is also going to couple with their ability to later crawl on their belly and creep on their hands and knees. If that is interrupted, this now will also lead to disruption in the hand development. When we are crawling and creeping, we are literally developing the arch in our hand. Again, my podcast audience, I'm holding up my hand and showing the curvature that would have been laid down when I was creeping and crawling and creeping. If we don't do that, if we don't do it long enough, it interferes with the development of the hand, which lots of times what I see is kids just cannot get down into the most distal end of their fingertips. They can't grip properly. Therefore, they're not going to be able to hold a pen in their hand. Their handwriting is going to be just atrocious. And their hands are going to hurt and they're going to want to push away. They're going to want to withdraw from that particular developmental sequence. This particular reflex has also, because it has so much involvement with the belly and, getting that byproduct of pregnancy out. And yes, that means children born by C-section, there's been a problem. And only through a developmental assessment are we going to know if it stuck around. I never put anything past the body, but I always want to make sure that we check. But this particular reflex has actually also been coupled with irritable bowel disorder symptoms, etc. So there's so many far-reaching pieces with these reflexes. They have so much involvement in how your nervous system gets wired up. They're the foundation. It's not an option. Everybody goes through this. You went through it. An adult that may be listening to this podcast, you did not avoid this. This is not a pathology. This is how we get wired up. But if these reflexes do not integrate, they are constantly tripping up the communication, the connectivity, how everything gets wired up in that brain between the lower brain and the higher brain. And it is so important to have these pieces evaluated, especially if you've been listening to these podcasts and you're going, wow, that's something that my child does go through, or maybe you go through. But children are so close to the beginning. It is not difficult to work and get their nervous system going in the direction that it's meant to be. I always talk about a set of dominoes. And when I think about these reflexes, it's like a domino has been pulled out of the sequence. And if you will go back far enough and you will correct it, most times you put that domino back, you give it that little push, and everything begins to flow. It's the marvelousness of how we are wired up. Well, thanks so much for tuning in. Make sure you go over and you look at the YouTube channel. We've got one, Connect My Brain, that is a lot of earlier videos that I did. And then we created a second one called Dr. Laura Hansen. And this is where we have focused on putting all of the podcast videos. Make sure you go over to the website. There are show notes, there are blogs, and share this information. My heart is to give this to you, but my bigger idea is share it with someone. There are so many kids that are struggling. There are so many families that have been just on these therapeutic missions their whole lives, and maybe they haven't been given much hope, but there is always hope. Make sure you share the podcast, you share the website, and download Dr. Laura's developmental milestones. Thanks again to my tremendous team, Marcy Page and Natasha, who always help me keep things together and are an absolute instrumental part in sharing this information to the world. Be blessed.